it out. And that's about it for small obstacles. As far as rough terrain, flying around locations that have rugged terrain, that also produces mechanical turbulence. So when air flows over rough terrain, typically that enhances the vortices and also enhances the shear. The United States Air Force in their forecasting says that rough terrain is anything that sticks up 1,000 feet above the surroundings. So here we go. We're going to talk about the characteristics of rough terrain. Of course, as I mentioned, the surface irregularities increase the shear in the lowest layers of the atmosphere, and with stronger shear, you tend to get stronger vortices. So the factors that affect how you get turbulence down low with rough terrain include the orientation of the terrain. In other words, how the hills or ridge lines are oriented, also the wind direction and speed, how fast the terrain drops off, and then finally the other things that we talked about when we discussed surface friction turbulence. So orientation of terrain, look at the ridge line or look at how the terrain is oriented and try and visualize with the wind where you're going to get your turbulence. Whether the wind is parallel with the ridge line or perpendicular, that gives you an idea where you can expect it and how far down. Also, the slope of the terrain. If the terrain has a very smooth slope, then the vortices tend to be smaller and less intense than if it drops off very rapidly, which enhances the shear and produces much stronger turbulence. And also the other factors we talked about when we discussed surface friction turbulence. Remember, we said the time of year tends to be thicker in the summertime, and the time of day in the afternoon you tend to get more turbulence as a result of rough terrain. And then finally, in an atmosphere where it's unstable, tends to produce a much thicker boundary layer. So boundary layer increases with rough terrain and also increases during the summertime and the afternoon under unstable conditions. And typically, sometimes you can see the boundary layer so deep it may go up to 10,000 feet MSL. A good example of this is out in western North Dakota, where there's rough terrain. Sometimes during the winter time, when the winds are very strong, we're talking 40 knots over the ground, you may see turbulence all the way up to 10 to 12,000 feet. But when the winds are only about 25 knots over the ground, they may put out a airmet for turbulence only up to 6,000 or 8,000 feet. Here are some rules of thumb from the Air Force. We already discussed one. We said in the surface friction section that when wind was more than 30 knots over the ground, you can get moderate turbulence. Now, with rough terrain, that number drops down to 25. So moderate turbulence with wind speeds of 25 knots over rough terrain. That was the Air Force forecasting rule of thumb. And then if the wind speeds exceed 40 knots, you'll get severe turbulence over rough terrain. So how do you fly this kind of turbulence? What you need to do is when you're flying at an airport in an area where it's rough terrain, if the airport's located on higher terrain like on a mesa, you want to make sure that you have positive control, kind of similar with small obstacle type turbulence, which means that on departure you want to accelerate to a higher airspeed and then maintain a slightly higher airspeed as you climb out so that you don't stall the airplane and exceed the critical angle of attack. And then also when you're climbing out, be mindful that the wind is following the terrain. So if you're taking off from an airport that sits on a mesa, then you probably are going to see an updraft as you depart. And that's if the winds are more than 20 knots over the ground. The updrafts can be anywhere from 100 to 500 feet per minute close to the ground. Also remember, similar to surface friction, you want to climb above the boundary layer to get into the smooth air. As I mentioned, sometimes that might be up to 10,000 feet or higher, depending upon how strong the winds are over the ground. And then be wary of flying in a downwind of ridge lines under high wind conditions. You want to fly, of course, at higher altitudes above the rough terrain. And then as you're crossing ridge lines, remember that the winds may accelerate and you may see some shear and also some more turbulence right over the mountain or right over the hills or just downwind of the hill. It's preferable to fly on the upwind side of the hills. And then finally, as we discussed before, as you enter the boundary layer, you might want to slow down to your maneuvering speed or below your maneuvering speed so that you won't overstress the aircraft. And then coming in for a landing, typically under strong wind conditions you'll be bringing in power, and also you want to be mindful of the aircraft configuration, meaning that you probably don't want to use full flaps. And then of course use a higher airspeed, and you can use the gust factor. We talked about that, how you take 1/2 the gust factor and add that to your final approach speed. And then on final approach, if you're landing at an airport on a mesa, you can experience downdrafts on final approach because the wind is following the terrain, and the downdrafts can be anywhere from 100 to 500 feet per minute up to 1500 feet AL. Here's a case that I used to fly actually in Wyoming, and I used to go every day. I used to actually make 11 takeoffs and landings across Wyoming when I flew there as a Part 135 pilot flying a Piper Seneca. And I used to go into Kemmer, Wyoming every day. And that's where Kemmer is located in southwestern Wyoming. And you can see that the terrain out there is pretty rugged. Actually, there is a strip mine just to the west of the airport. And there's the terrain. You can see that you're sitting at 7,200 feet, but it drops off very rapidly, especially on the south end of the airport, all around the airport. The airport sits on top of a mesa. And on one particular day when I was coming in for a landing at Kemmer, the winds were pretty strong. They were 25 knots, but they were right down the runway. And on short final, I was on final approach. My airspeed got a little bit slow. I had the airplane full. I was flying with a 135 check pilot, and he told me that I would lose it on final. And he was right. I ended up losing quite a bit of altitude on final. Had to bring in the power quite a bit to get to the end of the runway, and we encountered a downdraft as we approached the.
That's all I have for you for this lecture. I hope you enjoyed it, and you should watch the mountain turbulence lecture next.